Aloha mai kako. My name is Healoha Johnston, and I am the Interim Director of Curatorial Affairs here at the Honolulu Museum of Art. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the museum's Doris Theater for what we know will be a thought-provoking evening. Tonight's program is part of our ongoing initiative to inspire civic engagement in collaboration with community partners. Taylor Chang, our director and curator of the Doris Duke Theater, excels at bringing together people and ideas through film and dialogue. She will oversee tonight's program. Please join me in welcoming Taylor Chang to the stage.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and honoring us with your presence and your minds and your ideas. We're incredibly excited for the conversations that will be had in this space this evening. Tonight is part of the Honolulu African American Film Festival 2018 programming in celebration of Black August. And a lot of people came together to support and make tonight possible, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize each and every one of them. First, I'd like to recognize the members of the Honolulu African American Film Festival Committee. I'm going to list their names: Sandra Sims, Sharon Yarbrough, John Nichols, whose artwork is in the lobby, Kemi Glenn, Marcia McFadden, Tadia Rice, Daphne Barbie Wooten, and Ethan Caldwell. Yes. The committee has been integral in helping the museum establish and perpetuate the film festival for the past 7 years. And they've been working really hard to continue its evolution and growth with events such as this tonight. And this event is generously sponsored by the Pōpolo Project. I'd like to thank Akiemi Glenn and all the members and the board of the Pōpolo Project for their integral support and collaborative support for this event. It was important for everyone involved to be able to create space for a conversation that we seldom saw happening. And it was incredibly important that we could facilitate a convergence of ideas and perspectives that are not often put together. On behalf of the Honolulu African American Film Festival Committee and on behalf of the Pōpolo Project, Dr. Akiemi Glenn, who will be our moderator for the 2 talks this evening, will speak further to the intention of the conversations, and she will also be introducing Blackbird. Dr. Akiemi Glenn is a Honolulu-based scholar and culture worker. Akiemi's primary interests are in how indigenous peoples, refugees, captives, migrants, and other diasporic peoples in the Pacific and the Americas use language to construct, navigate, and politicize their identities. Akiemi is the founder and the curator of the Pōpolo Project, a multimedia exploration of Blackness in Hawaii and the larger Pacific. Please join me in giving an incredibly warm welcome for the amazing Akiemi Glenn.
Aloha, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you. This has been a program long in development. I just want to echo Taylor again and thank all of the members of the Honolulu African American Film Festival Committee who kind of had this idea about a year ago. And I also just want to acknowledge my board and staff from the Pōpolo Project who've put in so much work to help us bring this to fruition tonight. As Taylor mentioned, the Pōpolo Project is a community organization, and we're very dedicated to exploring what Blackness means in Hawaii and the larger Pacific. And we often get the question, what exactly is the value of doing that in a place where there are not that many Black people? And we find that in our work, we're really nested and really grounded in a series of questions. We have that question too. What is the value of doing this? And I think tonight and the conversations that we'll have tonight actually speak to those questions in some really interesting ways. The first thing that we really want to talk about as we bring some of this content to you this evening is what does it mean to be Black anywhere? And the first film that we have actually, hopefully, will kind of challenge you to think about some of the histories of the Pacific that are often unknown, in part because those histories have happened to bodies that are raised as Black. We are very fortunate to be able to premiere Blackbird, which is a wonderful film produced by the Solomon Islander filmmaker who now resides in Australia, Amy Batalabasi, who has produced this short film about the history of her ancestors who were taken from their islands in the mid-19th century and taken to Australia to work on sugar plantations. And you'll see at the very beginning of the film in the epigraph that appears before the actual visuals that this started in the mid-1860s. And if you think about American history, what was happening in the US at that time, and also some of the work of our guests that we'll have in just a few minutes, Ta-Nehisi Coates, thinking about pulling that thread through and the fact that the ways that we've encountered Blackness, the ways we've encountered race in general, not only in the Atlantic world, but around the world because of the global spread of white supremacy through colonization and empire, it's actually reshaped the ways that we see each other and the way that we think about kinship. So I'm really fortunate to be able to be here tonight to be your moderator. You'll be seeing more of me and hearing more from me too. But I just wanted to share with you that our intention is really to bring forward this conversation that's not just about Black people, because when we talk about race, when we talk about Blackness, we'll see that this actually is about how we think about family, land, relationships for all of us. So without any further ado, we'll share Blackbird, and then we will have a short panel discussion to kind of contextualize the film.
Ponepate Rokulekutu and Dr. Luafata Simanu Klutz, and our moderator Akiemi Glenn to the stage. Dr. Ponepate Rokulekutu is an instructor of Indigenous politics and Pacific Island studies. His research is on the economic marginalization of Native Fijians in the colonial experience, and he has contributed critical perspectives on the political impacts of the notion of Melanesia and a Black Pacific in a unifying identity in Pacific politics. Dr. Luafata Simanu Klutz is an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii's Department of Indo-Pacific Languages and Literature, where she teaches Samoan language, literature, and history. Her research, poetry, and playwriting focus on the often unknown aspects of Pacific women's history, especially in political representation and empowerment in resistance to colonial forces. And Dr. Akiemi Glenn, of course, as our moderator. Thank you.
So we're so fortunate to have my two colleagues here on stage to help us kind of contextualize that film. I know for many of us in the audience, it might have been the first time that we've seen a depiction of blackbirding or heard about that particular history. So I'd like to open it up to you two as a historian and political scientist to help us kind of contextualize what we've just seen.
Aloha and Bulavinaka. My name is Ponepate, has been mentioned, and I'm from Fiji, and I teach at the Center for Pacific Island Studies. I'm going to very briefly provide the background, a historical background to this, and I will then give the time to Dr. Fata to make a commentary on the film, and I'll contribute after that. But I think that it is important to provide an historical context to this very important issue of blackness, the notion of blackness, and the experiences of blackness in the context of the Pacific Islands, or what is contemporarily known as Oceania. The abolition of slavery in the 13 North American colonies towards the 18th century, towards the end of the 18th century, which began in Vermont in 1777, and the British enactment in 1833 of the Slavery Abolitionist Act, which was an extension of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, did not mean the end of slave trade or the transatlantic slavery. Slaveholders and slave recruiters relocated themselves in the islands of the Pacific and resumed the practice of slave trade from the cotton and copra plantations in Fiji and the sugar plantation in Queensland, Australia. In Fiji, Itaukeis, or indigenous Fijians, were initially used as laborers in the copra and cotton plantations. But as resistance against routine work increased, causing conflict between planters and natives, the planters looked elsewhere to secure a reliable source of manual labor. In Australia, the end of convict transportation ended in 1868. Australia, as we all know, was initially established in 1788 by the British government as a penal colony. These convicts provided manual labor in the sugar industry. Between 1788 and 1868, a total of 164,000 British convicts were transported to Australia. The end of the convict transportation in 1868 necessitated the search for alternative sources of labor that led to the practice of labor trade in the islands of the Pacific, and specifically in Melanesia, where laborers were obtained from the Loyalty Islands, which is part of the French territory of New Caledonia, New Hebrides, which is currently Vanuatu, and of course the Solomon Islands. What initially started as a mutual agreement between labor recruiters and Melanesians eventually led to kidnapping, or what has become known as blackbirding. Blackbirding originated from the African slave trade, or the transatlantic slavery, which entailed experiences of exploitation akin to slavery, atrocities, and the evisceration of human dignity. There were 870 voyages back and forth to the islands in which Melanesians were kidnapped, enslaved, and stripped of their human dignity. Like the African slave trade, blackbirding was predicated on the unfettered, unencumbered, unconstrained tendency of the white race to enslave blacks or people of color, an attitude that is based on what Coates described as birtherism, or in what he articulates, and I quote, as an ideology of white supremacy in all its truculent and sanctimonious power. I will give this time to Dr. Fata to provide a brief commentary on the film, and I will add to it. Thank you.
Talo falava. I can go all kinds of ways, but I'm very mindful of the film. And so I just want to add that it wasn't just to Australia that the Solomon Islanders went. The Germans brought them to Samoa to work the coconut plantations because the Samoans didn't want to work long hours. And so the Solomon Islanders came in, they established a settlement, and when the Germans left, the New Zealanders, who subsequently took over the colonization of Samoa at the time, did not really mandate that they went back to the Solomon Islanders. So there's this group, population of descendants of the Solomon Islanders that have lived there for maybe 3 or 4 generations. And when we talk about Blackness, we certainly see that as an example of how that concept also is very, very confused, if you will, misunderstood, and often exploited. And so recently, the descendants of these workers that came in the 19th century were relocated or dislocated from the space that their ancestors had developed for them in the town area to a different place because the government wanted to develop this real estate for capitalism, if you will. And so there's a film coming out. There is a documentary by Oscar Kitely, who did the Samoan wedding, that talks about this dislocation of the descendants of the Solomon Islanders in Samoa. Of course, the Irish also did some blackbirding in Polynesia and kidnapped a lot of people from the low-lying atolls and took them to Chile and Peru, where they needed workers for the guano fields. You know, the bird shit. That's a bit of history that's not very well known. That when you're in an atoll, you really don't have anywhere to escape. So that was very easy for the schooners to come in and take the people. So it's very, 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 very sad that this has happened in the Pacific. We all thought that slavery was on the American continent, but we did not realize that it also happened in Oceania. And so Blackness is something, at the personal level, I grew up with. In Samoa, a dark person, a black person, is called meoli, which means black thing. So because I have darker skin than many Samoans, I was always labeled that. And I thought, is that why I don't have boys coming after me? So guess what I did? I left the planet and got into the haole world. I'm not sure that was good either. But anyway, but Blackness has been racialized as well. And I'm not quite sure that the colonizers brought that. I think already in our own societies, we had these notions of darkness as ugly, and therefore really affected a lot of gender relations. So I asked my buddy over here, so who did you pick? Dark Fijian girl? Oh, I'm saying too much, my brother. So I said, so who did you pick, Pori? Dark person that you are? So he'll answer that.
No, no, no.
Fata, you touched on it just a little bit, but I wonder if either of you could talk about kind of the contemporary impact of these histories, possibly blackbirding, but also the ways that European conceptions of race have kind of entered into the Pacific, Blackness being one of the kind of anchoring ideas there. Are there any kind of contemporary reflections that you have, either of you, or context that you can kind of give us to help think about the reverberations of this history?
What I'm noticing a lot more is this politics of color among the Pacific Islanders, and it troubles me. I still haven't been able to articulate it better, so that I don't sound like this victimized dark thing that But I think it's becoming more and more obvious with young generations reviving some of the language that was derogatory during the colonial period, such as the term afkasi, which was the term for the hapa, or we call the half-caste children of Euro-American and Samoan parents. And so the revival of that term is something that needs to be talked about, because I think our millennials are coming out and saying it's okay to be, there is nothing wrong with being Afkasi. But for people like me, what does that mean? Because Afkasi with lighter skin were also very privileged. They were well received in both worlds. People like me and Pony had to go to school and learn to speak good English. I think we succeeded in that. But I worry that our young generations may be thinking that Blackness or the politics of color began with the colonizers. But what we tried to do is that let's look, before the colonizers came, to really be able to understand what it means to be black and to be dark. Because we have, in the islands, we have our own different terms. But contemporarily, being colored in America, for our Samoan kids, for example, has not been a good thing. But I see the pride in the Samoan-ness not totally understood, and therefore become left out or misunderstood because of the notion that, we are racialized like this because of American politics. And to a large extent, that's true. But I want them to know that, within our own cultures, we may have these, and we may see that in church. We may see it even in academics. We may see it in the commercial world. Funny, each time I go home, I don't see people that look like me in the leadership positions. What is that? Okay. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but maybe Pony can expand on that.
Thank you, Dr. Fado. Now, I'm sure that we all have our own analysis. We can provide our own commentary on the film. But I want to go beyond that and talk about something that I think is important in this discussion. And that is the concept or the notion of black and the experiences of blackness is complex in the context of the islands of the Pacific or in the context of Oceania. In the United States, it's a binary between white, privileged white in the mainstream, and African Americans, if I may say that. In the context of the Pacific Islands, it's complex. What you see as black in the Pacific is not necessarily black to Pacific Islanders. I will share my experience as an Itauke. When we talk about Tongans or Samoans or Polynesians, we don't talk about whiteness. There is a concept that we use that is not necessarily white, and that is red. The concept of Ndamundamu, red. The concept of Ndamusa. Ndamusa means something that is reddish. And it connotes superiority. It connotes the idea of something that is delightful to look at. And that is the kind of concept that's how we conceptualize whiteness in the context of the islands of the Pacific, at least from the perspective of an Itauke, an indigenous Fijian. And so to us, the Tongans, the Maoris, the Kanaka Maoli in the islands of Hawaii, they are not black, they are Ndamundamu. And there's a degree of superiority that is level to that. I had the unfortunate experience of marrying a Tongan. I can say that because I'm Fijian.
Why did you marry a Tongan?
And I had first,
Answer my question. Sorry, Akiemi, we're taking this over.
Well, I just want to be brief because I think that this is something that is unknown in the context of North America. That the idea of blackness is complex in the Pacific, and that in Tongan context, uli uli is the concept that you articulate blackness, and uli uli means something that is dirty. I had the first-hand experience of Itauke, an indigenous Fijian, in the Tongan society, where Tongans treat you with they patronize you, but beyond that patronizing attitude is an inherent contempt for blackness. In the Tongan concept, and I can challenge any Tongan here who want to challenge that. That is, the concept of uli uli is black or dirty. And the idea of whakawhisi. Whakawhisi means anything that is Fijian is derogatory. Adultery is whakawhisi. Stealing is whakawhisi. And so, these are the complexities, some of the complexities of how blackness is conceptualized. And so, having said that, let me say something controversial, and that is, the issue of blackness is not something that is necessarily created by the colonizer. They institutionalize it. But these ideas are inherent in our cultures, as Fade said. I think I said too much.
That's perfect. And I think that's actually a wonderful note for us to end on. Thank you.
Our featured guest speaker, Ta-Nehisi Coates, is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Between the World and Me. winner of the National Book Award. His recent book, We Were 8 Years in Power, is a collection of his essays on the Obama era. He is a journalist and was a regular columnist for The Atlantic, writing some of the most groundbreaking essays on contemporary American politics. He also currently writes for the Black Panther and Captain America comic books. Please join us in the warmest welcome for Ta-Nehisi Coates.
So here we are with the main event. We're so glad that you're here, Ta-Nehisi. As you all know, we were originally scheduled to do this on the 25th of August, but Hurricane Lane had other plans for us, so he was so gracious to come back and be with us tonight. So to start off our evening, we're going to invite Ta-Nehisi to do a short reading for us.
Sure. This is well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's such a chore to have to come to Hawaii. I would so much rather be in sweltering New York City. So it took a lot of hard work for me to stay at that very beautiful hotel right on the beach. I'm trying not to suffer too much. So when we had the initial appearance and it was canceled because of the hurricane. Actually, the way it was supposed to work was I was supposed to go from here to Australia and then come back. And it became pretty clear it was quite possible to go there and then stop here on the way back. And as I said, even though it was very difficult to make a second visit to Hawaii, I figured I could accommodate it to my very busy schedule. But I have to tell you, no, thank you, and I mean that. I have to tell you, one of the most endearing and enlightening aspects of this is you have no idea what it means to grow up in a place like West Baltimore, where I'm from. To go to Washington, D.C., where I went to college and met my wife, and even to move up to New York and be in that very, as I am increasingly learning, narrow world, and have Blackness come to mean something to you, but to go all the way to Australia, all the way to the other side of the world, and to meet people who call themselves Black there, to meet people who understand, this is profound, what it means to be called a nigger. All the way in Australia, and people who I guess, and I'm still thinking my way through this, would not, traditionally call as part of, the African diaspora, but are certainly by their experiences part of the Black world. This was not an expectation that I had. Obviously I knew about the Aboriginal experience to some degree, but I certainly didn't expect the things that I reflected on my very narrow American view of what Blackness meant, to find sisters, brothers, all the way on the other side of the world. There's a second tragic part of that, and that is, and I was saying this to my wife when we were, just about to leave. What does it mean to go about as far from Europe as you possibly can? To be about as far from Europe as you possibly can, and for whiteness to find you anyway. In all of its violence, and in all of its spirit of conquest, and all of its oppression, and I want to be clear about this because I talk about this a lot. I don't know if I'm gonna make it to the reading. I was
That's
actually.
That's all right. We're easy.
Sorry, this is actually struck by listening to you guys talk, which we'll get to in a second. But when I say that, I don't mean, and I just had to say this over and over again, I don't mean for people with blue eyes to find you. I don't mean for people with blonde hair to find you. I mean people who have erected an ideology around blue eyes and blonde hair, which justifies the extraction of wealth from other people. To be that far away and to find that present, and to find people in such deep pain that far away, and then to come back here and to be here and to hear, and again, like, these are things that, in my education. You hear about, the experience of slavery and what it means outside of an American context. So you sort of know that it happened in other places, but you don't really know. And to see you guys on stage, speaking about Blackness, I have quite a bit to think about. So more than anything, I really want to thank you guys for educating me. One of the things that happens is that when you have some success, and I've tried to reiterate this over and over again in my public experiences, because you have some sort of success doing one particular thing, say writing a book, people overestimate the amount of knowledge you have. They do. They just do, man. They do. And there's this, and it's almost like it's like how when people are like wealthy or rich, like we as Americans assume that means that they're intelligent. It's something you automatically make that assumption. But it's actually the same thing. I guess it's success. If you have any sort of success in a particular thing, there is an assumption that you must, be successful across, in these other worlds. And it especially means in the intellectual world, where I would argue people have, well, let's just be real about it, profited off of that notion. It is very important for you to know that I don't just come here as somebody, who is addressing you or dispensing knowledge, but as a consumer too. And I try to keep that true in all of my travels. So I just want to thank you. I mean, even, the short period of seeing the film and listening to the panel has been quite educational. So I guess I'm skipping the reading. Sorry.
Well, I really appreciate you kind of, reflecting on this experience. I actually have a lot of questions about that experience. But before we kind of get into that, I'm curious about, as you're at this stage of your career, as you're visiting us here in Hawaii, you just come back from Australia, there's a lot that's been said about you and your work and its impact. Toni Morrison has said that she was wondering who was going to fill the intellectual void left by James Baldwin, which is amazing. I'm sure that's something that sits with you still. And you really came to prominence working with The Atlantic, which is a very old publication, 160 plus years old. As Taylor mentioned, you've been writing for the Marvel Universe as well. And I'm just curious how you situate yourself as a part of a kind of genealogy of thinking, of knowledge creation, of Black reflection.
Well, you have to go back to actually how I was raised. I come from, I mean, you really could take it back to like my grandfather, I guess. I come from, on my father's side of the family, from my grandfather to my father to myself. I think I come from a particular line of men, I guess, who had a level of intellectual curiosity, but were not particularly good about funneling that through the established institutions, by which I mean school. I was a really, really bad student. That is a statement of fact. I'm not, it's not an overstatement. I did the Henry Louis Gates show, Finding Your Roots, and they sent me my transcript from high school, and it was worse than I actually thought it actually was. But I was always a deeply, deeply curious person. My dad had pretty much been the same way. He was deeply, deeply curious. He used to, cut school to go to the library, to the museums, the public museums in Philadelphia. He was a Vietnam veteran, joined the Black Panther Party after, Vietnam. And the most exciting thing to him about the Black Panther Party was it was people around him who read books. And he could actually have, this was more exciting than the guns. He could actually have conversations. When he left the Black Panther Party, he started a program to, ship books into the prisons. And then after that, founded his own publishing company and then eventually a printing company. He did go back to college and eventually get his degree, but, for much of this period, he was basically a high school dropout. That was what he was. But his performance in school was separate from the idea of being intellectually curious about the world. As it happens, there's a long line of Black people like that, who were very, very curious, collected books, were readers, but simply just could not fit within, established channels. So I guess if I think about myself, I think about the tradition of Black autodidacts, in this country, which I actually include Baldwin in, by the way, who I believe did not graduate from college. I don't think he even went. Yeah, okay, all right. So I think there's a long tradition of Black folks like that. One of the things that's happened happily since the 1960s is the Academy has been much more open to Black people, and so much of the intellectual current today actually comes out of the Academy. People who are doing things like me, usually are PhDs, or similarly situated. I'm not, and I don't take pride of that in the sense that I feel like the Academy's worthless or anything like that. But I guess I do know that that's not, and probably never should be, like the source of whatever power that I'm bringing forth. It's all the people who came before me who were doing the exact same thing.
Well, in that sense of being an autodidact or directing kind of your own intellectual curiosity into new venues, I really remember and was very, very struck by some of your writing about the Civil War. I myself, I've been in Hawaii for some time, but I grew up in Virginia in a place that was very marked by the Civil War, where people in Spotsylvania County, in Fredericksburg,
course, yeah.
if anybody is into Civil War history.
Yeah.
But this was a place that even when I was growing up there, talking about reenactments is one thing, but people were living this on a daily basis and really kind of holding up that time. And, I remember reading some of your writing in The Atlantic about your foray into that history. And as a Black person who had grown up around that history being showered on me and resisting it in a lot of ways, I was really struck by the ways that you encountered that. And when I think about the Civil War, especially as we are here in the Pacific and Hawaii, the Civil War was such an interesting moment for the U.S. And when it kind of reconstituted itself and Reconstruction and all of that afterwards, became a kind of different animal in some ways. And some of that animal led to them coming here. So we're sitting here.
How?
Well, for me, I think about part of what seemed to happen after the Civil War was that the United States really wanted to have a national project together, and pushing the boundaries of empire seemed to be a really important one. And so we saw, 30 years later, after the end of the war, we see 1898, we see the Caribbean, we see the Philippines, we see Hawaii be involved in that project. So I'm just curious about how did you kind of make the first forays into encountering that history, and what do you make of it now that you're here, but also that you've kind of seen this thread coming through? We're in the middle of the Trump administration, beginning of the Trump administration. We're seeing a resurgence of white supremacist politics in public spaces. We just last week saw folks at the University of North Carolina pull down that Silent Sam statue. So there's still a lot of conflict around that conflict in particular. What do you make of that?
Well, a lot more after what you just said. No, but I'm being real about that because it's actually very interesting. There's a scholar who I'm sure you're familiar with, David Blight. And he wrote this book called Race and Reunion, and it's about how the Confederates and the Neo-Confederates won the War of Memory. And we're still underneath of that. And the idea was that there were all these projects done to forge this, the America that came out of that. And that, I think, leads directly into what you were just saying. Again, I had thought about some of the Westward, wars against Native Americans, for instance, but war is one of the great, forges of identity, regrettably. It's fascinating to think about. Because where do you start? Like, there's so many layers, right? So on one level, there is, and I think one of the reasons why you were repulsed, I know certainly why I was repulsed when I was a kid, because there's a story that people tell about the Civil War as James McPherson, says, a violent football game. So this idea there was nothing actually of principle at stake. You had two sides, Rasheed Wallace said, both sides played hard, and that was pretty much the way it was talked about. Both sides played hard, and we can both agree, both forgot, and we both get to have honor. And what was not loudly broadcast until relatively recently was that one side was trying to erect a republic rooted in the enslavement of Black people. And the other side, if at the beginning certainly didn't want to go to war, to abolish slavery, wanted to protect the Union as it was constituted and eventually, evolved largely through, the militant actions of Black folks into a war against slavery. You know, what I came to see was that if you think about Black people arriving in what becomes the United States in 1619, next year will be 400 years of us having been here. I came to perceive Black people as being at war from that moment, and the North eventually joining. Do you understand?
Yeah.
And it's like unwieldy alliance. You know, but there is a strong argument that Black people were fighting from the moment that they got there. I mean, you can even use, enroll European Enlightenment philosophy in this. Locke talks about slavery is the state of war continued. You know, and the notion that the slave is, in, war with the master at all points. That's not an exact quote, but basically, that's the notion. And seeing it in that way, Black folks were always fighting. What's interesting to me, though, is what comes out of that. And I think you just, spoke to that. Like, there's a way of wanting to claim the Civil War and being happy about it, right? Because, you get emancipation out of that. But war is never happy, ultimately. Do you know what I mean? Like, war is never, even, the fruits that you claim out of it, it's never ultimately glorious. It's interesting, I mean, even at a sub-level, about how ultimately we're enrolled in this kind of, as Black people, because we're American, in this imperialist project nonetheless. It's fascinating. I probably had more firm conclusions, you know what I mean, 2 or 3 years ago. But the more you think about it, the more you see and the more you travel, you see how complicated things are.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could speak a little, you alluded to it a little bit, talking about your recent experience in Australia. But I remember you also writing about your experience abroad in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you find Blackness abroad, especially the idea of Black bodies and also kind of where the boundaries of Blackness are in these new spaces that you're encountering?
Well, very, very differently. Very different there and the same all at once. It was interesting hearing about the conversation about what Blackness is in the Pacific. Because at least in Europe and America, when we think about enslavement, we have, and I tried to articulate this in my book, better, historians and, better thinkers than me, Edmund Morgan, for instance, have put this better. But my notion was, basically that race was the child of racism, not the father. And the idea is that the racism comes first. The wanting to do something to you comes first, and then people invent all sorts of justifications for it afterwards. So, like, I've done, been in conversation a lot, actually, with my wife and with other folks about, for instance, why racism lands a particular way on Black women in America. And in a way that when I went to France, I didn't think it landed in the same way. So, for instance, it was very interesting to me that it is only recently, and actually still very rarely, that you would see dark-skinned Black women in beauty ads, or any sort of position that was held up as beautiful in America. That's why, people think Lupita is revolutionary. But we would see on the street and see Black women in beauty ads. We would see white men on the street with dark-skinned Black women, which was absolutely, absolutely fascinating. But then you would think about why those things were true. And I want to be clear, this is not an argument about like France being a less racist society. It's just about how, as I'm going to get to in 1 second, but it's just about how things, ultimately play out, like they manifest in different ways. And what you realized was that America had one of the largest slave societies in world history right on its door, right there. Right there. You go to Mississippi, the majority of people are enslaved. South Carolina, majority of people are enslaved in 1860. Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia. I mean, they're huge communities of enslaved people. And when men have power over enslaved people, they tend to do things that men do when they have power. That's why we look the way we look as Black people in America. And so there's always this kind of sexualization of slavery. And thus, a kind of a sexualization of Black women in a particular way in America because of that long history that we have. Now, France did its share of dirt, but it generally did it overseas, in terms of Black folks. And so it's a very, very different idea, except this. I would ask, my friends, like if they had the, hierarchically organized, like who was on the bottom, in a way that, in terms of oppression. And they would put obviously the Roma at the absolute bottom. And then after that, they would actually put North Africans and, who they called Arabs over there. And then they would put Sub-Saharan Africans above that. And I said, why would that be? Because, from an American perspective, you think about it from skin color, right? So you expect the blacks the black Sub-Saharans to be on the bottom. And their trauma is different than ours. Their trauma is the Algerian War. And the fact that the Algerians actually kicked their ass, in this colonial war, and they have not gotten over it yet. And so it's not that, black, I just want to be really, really clear about this. It's not that black Sub-Saharan Africans have it great over there any more than it is that Latinos have it great in America, which nobody would ever argue. But you see how these actual actions, how history actually matters more than some sort of preconceived notion of what is what. I got a buddy there whose ancestry is from Sub-Saharan Africa, and she's Muslim. And she said that, even though she does Ramadan, prays, that whole thing, the French don't consider her Muslim. Because when they say Muslim, they mean these Algerians. They have a very specific notion of what that is, almost racialized. You know what I mean? Religion almost taking that place. And so in some ways, it was, and this is to say nothing about what it means to be African American there, which is a whole different thing. But in some ways, it was hopeful because what you see is that these systems are made.
Yeah.
They don't evolve. It's not like God doing something. You know what I mean? That's not what's actually happening. Human beings decide X, Y, and Z is going to be true, and then results flow out from that. And so if they can be made, then in fact they can be unmade, actually.
Yeah. Speaking about systems being made, you've also written a lot about incarceration, and of course your classic piece on reparations, the case for reparations. We're here in Hawaii, and I don't know if you know this, but we are in the midst of a housing crisis. It's very hard to find a place to live here. And here, as elsewhere, what happens is that poverty is criminalized. Our city council right now is considering expanding the illegality of sitting and lying down in public, which is very interesting considering this is a destination that people will fly hours to so they can sit down and lie down in public.
Right.
We have a criminal justice situation here in terms of where our incarcerated people are. The Saguaro Correctional Center is in Arizona. Majority of our incarcerated males are there instead of here in Hawaii. And a majority still of those males who are incarcerated are Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. And those stats look very similar to what we see for Black people in the U.S. North American context. And, it's kind of we've been having this conversation about what empire looks like creeping. And these are systems that have been made.
So wait. If you're shipped out, you're not seeing your family.
You're not seeing your family.
That's a wrap.
Unless they can find a way to get there. That's
Yeah,
right. So that means they're
that's a
not
wrap.
doing it. Yeah. And that's the situation for the majority of our folks who are incarcerated from Hawaii.
Wow. Like I said, I came here to learn from you. Wow.
Well, and some of what you've written about and talked about in terms of the ways that incarceration has landed on Black families,
Right.
disrupts kinship, it
Right.
disrupts relationships to land, and we see that happening. This isn't probably news that it happens to Native Hawaiians and others here, but the scale, the sheer
Right.
scale, and the unique way that this particular system plays out in an island environment
Right.
that has all of this other stuff layered on top of it because of the U.S. presence here and the occupation. So I'm wondering, as we think about systems that have been made, and we think about kind of the creep of the carceral state, what are some things that you might have seen or been thinking about in your work as you've been kind of wrestling with this idea or seeing these stories come to you? What are some ways that this is being made, this carceral state is expanding, and what are some ways that it might be unmade?
I think when you think about the carceral state in America, it is the thing probably I have the hardest time imagining being unmade at this point, and probably my deepest source of skepticism about the idea of a post-racist society. Here's why, and I'm sorry, I have all of these numbers hard down in We Were 8 Years in Power. I just don't have them at hand. But we had in the late 60s to the 1970s, our incarceration rate per 100,000 was about where the rest of the quote unquote developed world was, in the 100 to 200 per 100,000. I believe we're somewhere around 700 per 100,000 now. There's nowhere that you can in the world. Nowhere. There's just nowhere. There's just nowhere. The United States, what is China? 1.3 billion people? I think something like that. I might be low. The point is that the United States incarcerates more people as a rate and as a total number than China, which is insane when you think about it. If you start going to those numbers by race and gender, it gets really, really insane. I think when I wrote my piece on mass incarceration, it was somewhere in the realm of all of the entire incarcerated population in the world, 8% were like black men, African-American men. The entire world. So if an alien came to this world and said, give me the typical imprisoned, incarcerated person, it would be a black male. That's what you would be most likely to get. I have great skepticism for seeing that something that large unmade. This sociologist, a great sociologist, Diva Pager, wrote this book called Mark, and it's about the mark of criminal justice on black people and how it affects particularly the ability of black men to get employment. Found that basically a black male who's a high school dropout but has no criminal record has about the same chance as a white male who does have a criminal record. So these are broad, far-reaching possibilities. In addition to that, she pointed out that if you decarcerated right now, you would have enough people basically to fill every job at McDonald's 5 times over. We have a huge problem. I mean, it's a huge, and one that has been, it's going to be handed down to generations. Here's the other problem. The carceral state actually has roots in how black people have been viewed in this country since we got here. Criminal justice is the preferred method for dealing with what Americans have typically referred to as a quote unquote Negro problem. It goes back to our very Constitution. We had a fugitive slave clause in our Constitution. Do you understand what that means? Is should a enslaved black person decide that freedom, something that was guaranteed to everybody else in this country, was something that should be guaranteed toward them and took actions, we had in our Constitution a clause that basically made it criminal to assist that black person in any sort of way, in our colonies, in states where slavery was no longer illegal. If you look at the rhetoric around fugitive or escaped, or however you want to put it, slaves in the antebellum period, it was typical to say that where they went had, for instance, in Canada, had devolved into, sites of great, great criminality. If you look at the postbellum period, when we have this era of lynching and terrorism against black people, crime is typically the charge that people make. Why are you doing this? Well, they're raping white women. Criminals. If you look at the leadership, for Black America, criminalization has typically been the answer for how that leadership was addressed. When Frederick Douglass escapes and becomes a fugitive slave, he's automatically a criminal, right? We're subject to arrest and shipped back, to his master. Harriet Tubman was running a massive criminal conspiracy. That was how she was looked at the time. I'm not exaggerating. That is literally how the state, viewed her. J. Edgar Hoover begins his career in law enforcement by attempting to disrupt Marcus Garvey, and then lives long enough to go on to disrupt Martin Luther King and the Black Panther Party. Martin Luther King is celebrated now. Everybody, Martin Luther King's great, from Donald Trump, on down. But in his day, Martin Luther King was considered a criminal by the highest arms of criminal justice in this country. The Kennedys signed off on Martin Luther King being bugged. J. Edgar Hoover publicly denounced him. This has effects. Like when a society trains itself literally over centuries to view black people as innately criminal, when its government responds to attempts to secure rights for those people, the same rights that anybody else has, by treating them as criminals, it trains itself to look at Black people as criminals. It's no mistake. And Michelle Alexander made this point, and I have to say, when I first read the book, I was like, come on. But it's true. It's true. It's no mistake that after the civil rights movement, you see this huge spike, in incarceration. And I'll make this, as plain as I can, for you. Two points of data point to, this actually being something conscious. Here's the first thing. Well, three actually. The first thing is if you look at the response to the civil rights movement, crime is always the thing that comes up. They're always accused of, somehow, being hoodlums or spraying. It's always the response. But here's the other thing. If you look at the ratio of incarceration of Black to white in northern cities before the civil rights era, and you look at the incarceration rate in the South, actually incarceration is really, really low in the South and is ridiculously high in the North. What happens after the civil rights movement is the incarceration rate in the South rises, and it's roughly the same as in the North. Now, why would that be? Because in the South, they had a system of social control already in place. There's no need for a high incarceration rate. And when that system is disrupted, it automatically takes on the features of the North. The second piece is that people often say this era of mass incarceration is a direct response to the high crime rate that America experienced in that period. But here's the problem with that. A rise in crime did happen, but it actually happened internationally. Happened in Europe, happened in Canada. It was an international phenomenon. The United States is unique in responding to that phenomenon with mass incarceration. So one has to answer all of these data points before one can say that people are just, acting rationally and, putting forth a program. In terms of the future, we have to figure out some way in which this country, which has been feeding itself myth after myth after myth about Black people and criminality, and now has an outrageous number of people basically being warehoused, how does it, A, develop some sort of ethic that says there should be real substantive decarceration? So how does it begin to tell itself a different story that combats literally centuries of telling itself another story? And how does it get those huge, ridiculous numbers down? This is, as you just exemplified and just spoke on, this is not just a problem for Black people. It's always the fact that this spills over. And there are other victims, who suffer from it. I knowing America, and I get this rap for despair and everything. I actually think I'm a happy, fun guy, so I don't know why people think that. But any serious look at history, it says that this is a huge problem. And there's nothing that's happening right now that would lead you to believe that, it is going to be dealt with anytime soon.
Well, you talking about these myths that the United States or that the whatever we want to talk about, the kind of cultural regime that we're living in, have given us makes me think about Hawaii as the myths especially about race here in Hawaii. So Hawaii has a very interesting and important history that often doesn't get talked about outside of here. This is the 175th anniversary of the overthrow of the government here and the occupation by the United States, the ongoing military occupation of Hawaii. And I think about, Hawaii was made a state in 1959, right around the same time as the civil rights movement was really kind of growing and becoming something that people couldn't ignore in North America. And, I know in a little bit of the work that I've done, it's been really striking to see how the commitment to presenting Hawaii as a racial paradise pairs with the criminalization, continued criminalization of Black people, and how Hawaii serves as a foil to that. And we see that quite a bit. After 1959, there was a huge propaganda campaign, essentially to make Americans think about Hawaii as part of this national project. We see it in things like Elvis's movies set here, We see the ways that people kind of talked about the docile Asian plantation worker population here versus the unruly Negroes flipping cars on the mainland. We also see it in the ways that Native Hawaiians were not really talked about in that project. Like Hawaii is full of Asian folks and that's it.
What do you think about the presentation of Hawaii and race in President Obama's memoir?
It's a really good question. I didn't grow up here, so that's one thing. And one of the things that I find in the work that we do at the Pōpolo Project is that the experiences of Black folks who grow up here is very different from the experience of those of us who come here as adults. I think that Obama had a certain audience and a certain kind of presentation that he was appealing to. But I think that if we can talk to the other folks who are here too, who have different experiences, I think that the fact of the diversity is real. Like Hawaii is very diverse. There's a lot of different kinds of folks here. Race operates here very differently. We're talking about what it means to be. You mentioned the kind of binary that we have in North America, Black or white, is kind of the categories that we see people in. Whereas in Hawaii, there's a lot of mixed race individuals who are able to be kind of multiple things at once, which is a little bit different than how it works elsewhere. But at the same time, that kind of racial paradise, everyone is friends, everyone's fine, seems to be a little bit complicated by the facts in a couple of ways. One is, for someone like Obama, or for any of us Black folks here, Black people are an extremely small number of our population. We're around 2% of the total population here. Many of the people who are living here are in the military, and they end up here. And we can also talk about how Black folks are overrepresented in the military and end up being overrepresented as Black, the face of Blackness here in Hawaii too, which is an issue. But it is really fascinating because it seems that people need that story that there is a place in America where everything is okay, where everyone can show up and be safe and fine. And I think about this. I moved here from New York City about 15 years ago. And living in Honolulu versus living in Brooklyn is absolutely a different animal, especially just in terms of the feeling of safety that I have as a Black person walking around. It doesn't mean that there's no such thing as police brutality. We have one of the highest rates per capita for police-involved violence. But the scale of it, the fact that I would be targeted for being a Black person is very different. And I just wonder what you think about why we need these myths. Why do we need these stories to tell ourselves? There's a whole storybook of them. There's the racial paradise of Hawaii. There's the American dream. There's all this stuff that we're kind of invested in telling ourselves.
So I think people find it very difficult to get through the world without myths. I think the world's a very difficult and tough place. And I think people want to believe that humans can be better than they are. And I'm not being sarcastic here. I don't think that's a necessarily incorrect belief. The question I often wonder is, as we critique these myths, what do we, well, I would ask two questions. One, is it true that human beings generally need myths, period? I think oftentimes, when we think about politics, we think about interests, support this, it'll help you, X, Y, and Z, support the Affordable Care Act, it'll give you ... You know what I mean? And we don't think about how these things accord with how people think about themselves, which I think is often manifested in actual myths. And if they do, what myths are we going to replace them with? Do you know what I mean? Are myths actually useful, even though they don't tell the whole truth, right? And I think I would argue that you can even find people, who you may be in agreement with, who, utilize myth. I think in there, often to, great effect. Again, just taking it back to the Civil War. I mean, you can look at some of the speeches and some of the writings, that Black folks did to each other about what, fighting in the Union Army would mean. And if you start critiquing it, I mean, you will get to, a very gendered, you immediately run into myths about gender, and you'll run into myths about America, right off the bat. One of the things I'm always struck by is how when I was a kid, the Buffalo Soldiers were heroic. And I don't know if that was true for you, but that was you know what I mean? That was supposed to be a good thing, And so the question I often ask is and we're going through this right now, right? Because we're tearing down statues, right? We're getting rid of myths. I think we're actually in a point, and I think that's actually has to do with why Trump actually won We are the myths that have traditionally undergirded America are actually under assault more than I think people actually realize. It's in our, this is an obvious point, but a movie like Black Panther is not a small thing. And it's not just not a small thing for Black people, it is not a small thing for white people at all. If you have grown up in a society where the myth was you are what is beautiful, and only you, because that's how whiteness is, it's total, it does not compromise. You know what I mean? There can be, and this is gonna be hard for, I think, people to hear, but in a multicultural society, whiteness actually can't exist. Because it's a racial argument about superiority. It's not just another flavor of ice cream. It's an argument that I'm the only ice cream and I'm the best ice cream and any other ice cream doesn't belong here, And so when you see, and you saw this like in the response, I always think about this relatively, I guess, Twitter famous, as they say, conservative, who tweeted out, from at the response to Black Panther, Wakanda does not exist. What do you care? Like, why do you care? Do you know what I mean? And this kid, he's like a huge Star Wars, Game of Thrones fan, right? But Wakanda's offensive. Do you know what I mean? And that's about myth, right? Like, that's about who gets to have myths. And, who doesn't? I work in comic books, man. And I have, a colleague and a friend, Eve Ewan, who's starting to write a comic book, and this was not like a comic book that anybody else was doing before they gave her own title. You know what I mean? It's just another comic book. And people were upset and went after her. I'm saying, this is the world of comic books, man. Do you know what I mean? And the very fact that this Black woman was going to write another, hero who was a Black, this was offensive to them. And so I think we're in this period where a lot of these ideas are under assault. It's one of the few things I'm actually hopeful about, because I think this is actually a real change. But the question I then ask, what are we going to replace them with? Do we need to replace them? And will we in turn replicate our own half-truths in doing that, right? I mean, Obama's a great example, right? Like, he told a very, very effective story about America that actually integrated Black people into that story. But, I think a lot of us would step back for a second and say, okay, but what's the actual story, though? You know what I mean? Like, once, we look at it from a distance, are we actually, part of this? When I was in, Australia, this woman, she asked me, said, what does it mean that, you had, because Obama's hugely popular in Australia, you had this hugely, popular first Black president, and he's dropping bombs on all of these places and all of these peoples, So I think, in this coming era, there will be a lot of interrogation for us to do, even of the stories that we propagate in response.
Yeah, wow. You mentioned Black Panther and Wakanda and the responses to Wakanda. I watched it here in Honolulu with a group of friends in a packed house. There were a lot of people who were really excited about it, and afterwards we hosted a conversation between some Black scholars and activists thinking about what the visuals, what the ideas of Wakanda, the technology, the engagement, the story, that the beauty that was in the film, how that could kind of speak to what we're thinking about here in Hawaii, thinking about how Wakanda and that whole story is a possible example for what Hawaii could look like when it's decolonized, when the U.S. leaves this place, and kind of use it as a space to kind of imagine that with Native Hawaiian scholars and activists as well. And I wonder, for us, we were really kind of grappling with the joy and the pleasure in viewing this film, and then also the kind of difficult militarized aspects of it. That the thing that makes Wakanda amazing is that it has this wonderful technology to build weapons. But at the same time, we're also connecting to this vision and this representation of a modern African indigeneity that's, I think, so many of us who are in the diaspora really kind of yearn for. Yeah. And I wonder, whether it's in your writing for Black Panther or your work more generally, or even in this last bit of travel, if you kind of have thought about or reckoned with a concept of Black indigeneity, thinking about those kinship ties and ties to the land.
I have, and I don't have much intelligent to say yet, just because it's so new. I mean, it's not new in the sense that it's one thing to, like, as a journalist, you prize, like, hearing it directly from people. So there are abstract notions of this that I knew, but I don't feel like my feet are on the ground enough yet to really to give the kind of insight that I would like to have. I can say that it is I think about, like, when I was a kid, listening to Malcolm's tapes and how he would talk about going out in the world and find that people that loved Black people, that's always and loved Blackness. That's always a beautiful feeling to have. Like, it's always great to find out that you have cousins somewhere that you didn't even know you had cousins. That's always a beautiful thing. What it ultimately means practically, I don't know. One of the things I am intrigued by is it's pretty clear that the people that oppress us are finding kinship around the world. Whiteness is very clearly making ties, you know what I mean, around the world. Whiteness is part of this whole Russia piece, as much as it's just, dismissed, but it's there. It's there. I was reading this really long piece in the New Yorker about Trump and Russia, and buried, like, in the, I don't know, 20th or 25th graph, one of the guys in Russia says, well, we needed, some sort of wedge in America that would allow us to, penetrate. Well, what's the obvious wedge? And so it's clear that, these folks are making what ours look like is a new question for me. I was raised in, like, this really heavy, nationalist, Pan-Africanist household. And so, like, I have the imagined part of it. And that's probably what I use, in a lot of Black Panther. But the hardcore practical aspect of it, that I tried to bring to bear, in, for instance, my work on incarceration, or on reparations. I can't give answers those informed yet. I just don't know enough yet.
What questions are you kind of sitting with around these ideas around
What are we supposed to do? Like, what does that mean, right? Like, so it's one thing to have, like, the very romantic notion of going somewhere and you find somebody who embraces Blackness and emotionally you feel a certain way. But what does that look like in terms of actual, like, political action? What does that mean? What are you guys supposed to do together? What do those coalitions look like? And I want to be clear, like, some of those coalitions are already happening, right? And I'm just not, but what am I supposed to do as a Black writer then? How am I actually supposed to write now? Because in my writing, the foe in general is American whiteness. That's what I know. That's what I, write about. Is it a way of me doing that is more globalized? That's harder than it sounds, though, right? Because, like, to actually do it with the effectiveness, like, I know American whiteness. I can, like, again, when you used to ask that question about incarceration, right? My threshold is to be able to answer it like that. Like, to be able to answer anything that you ask me that I'm actually going to speak on, I should be able to speak at least that well. And had I read the piece before I got here, I would have spoke even better than that. I have to, like, know on some deep, profound level what I'm talking about in order to speak. And so I guess, for me, the threshold to speak globally would be to look at the Aboriginal experience in Australia, look at the Black experience in Australia, and be able to speak with that kind of specificity. And then I can make real links, in an intelligent way. When I went to Howard, their whole thing, excuse my language, was, listen, we train you to go out here and fight these white folks. Like, that's what you have to be able to do. Their best person, who's defending whiteness, who went to Harvard, you have to be able to take them apart. And so what that meant was there's a very, very high threshold for debate and for, speaking. And, like, I think about that famous video of, like, Baldwin debating, Buckley, and how he's able to, like, take them apart, right? And Buckley's gone to Yale and done X, Y, and Z and has all of the credentials, but he don't really belong on the same stage as James Baldwin, right? Like, they shouldn't be talking to each other, actually. I got a buddy, he always jokes about this, the New Yorker, and I'm not taking a shot, they just went through this thing with Steve Bannon, and he always says, Steve Bannon should be debating, like, Umar Johnson or somebody. That's the level Steve Bannon's at. Like, that's equal. Yeah. That's equal. Steve Bannon and Umar Johnson are equal. But in this world, when you're white, like, you automatically, like, you pass go and get $200 right away, like, you start off ahead. And so there's a level that you really want to be at you don't want to sink to their level. You don't want to, like, just because they're out here and, being ignorant about it, so I don't mean you get to be ignorant. There's just a level I'm really, really trying to get to on this stuff that I hopefully will be able to get to, because there are questions even in my limited world that I still haven't answered, to speak intelligently. One last thing, what I think about a lot recently, that is the extent to which scholars and writers who I've admired in the past, and I was just talking to my wife about this the other day, had women who did so much labor for them. And so, like, you look at Du Bois, right? You see, wow, man, Du Bois was able to do this, he could do that. Well, why was Du Bois able to have that freedom to read that much? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
So, those things will not exist anymore. They should not exist. They shouldn't have existed then. This whole notion of wife, and I don't mean wife in the sense of just marrying somebody, but the traditional notion, like the whole idea of what that was, of somebody saying, well, here's this, brilliant man who's on high, and I'm just going to follow him, and I'll, assist him in his work, and he'll, stand on stage and have conversations like this. I don't have that in my life. Not only do I not have it in I should not have that in my life. I'm not wistful. Do you know what I mean? But you think about that, and it gives you a different perspective on why people who came before you were able to do so much. Even within that context, you're still talking about labor and the exploitation of labor. And so what does it mean to try to craft a new model for that in this world at this point?
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to end our conversation right there. We earlier were circulating some index cards that you folks had some questions for Ta-Nehisi on. And we have time for just a few of those. So let's see. Okay, so this first one. In addition to the films we saw this evening and the mainstream films such as Get Out, Black Klansman, and Sorry to Bother You, what authors and/or artists do you feel should have more recognition or role in the current conversation of race and Blackness? Anybody want to shout out?
Probably the best thing I have seen recently is this show, Random Acts of Flyness, by this artist. And his primary medium is television and film, but it's by Terrence Nance, and it's on HBO, and it comes on late at night. But we all have, those of us who have HBO now can get it on demand, and I highly, highly recommend that. That's probably the biggest thing. Random Acts of Flyness is revolutionary.
Yeah. Someone is asking, this is actually a quote that we've heard many times from Zora Neale Hurston, that not all skin folk are kinfolk. What is your advice for organizations to maintain their missions of peace and unification in this period of unabashed division in our country?
Wow. I'm not really qualified to answer that. And you have to understand why. Writers are by nature like solitary workers. I go into my cave and I spend a lot of time in that cave, and I read and I write and I come out and I interview people, but it's a much more limited way of working, which is very different than having to work with masses of people and get masses of people, on a particular line. I think I would be terrible at that. I'd be absolutely awful at it.
This second question may be related to that in some ways. This person is asking about your case for reparations, and I'm sure you've been asked this many times. What can be done to create pressure, political pressure, policy change around reparations?
Yeah, I think probably if I were to imagine how this would begin, and I think it's already started, I think the local movements for reparations are very, very important. And I think a broader, not allowing your opponents and your enemies to define what that means for you. So when I wrote the case for reparations, one of the things that was very, very important to me was that I make it very clear that the bill due Black people does not end in 1865. Because that's the first thing people say, well, slavery happened a long time ago, which is, an incredible statement in and of itself. But you should not cede the ground that it's only slavery that we're arguing. about. That, somehow after, the period of enslavement in America, everything was hunky-dory and okay. So I think there are efforts around the country. For instance, in Virginia, not in Virginia, it was in North Carolina, I'm sorry. There was, an effort, for reparations during the period in which people sterilized black women in a eugenics attempt. In Chicago, there was an effort on behalf of the victims of John Burge, who was a racist police officer who tortured black people. In Virginia, I believe there was a reparations case brought forth on behalf of school students in Virginia, because in response to Brown versus Du Bois and massive resistance, Virginia actually shut down its public schools in certain areas, period. And there were black people who were denied education around it. I think across the board, you can find cases like that. It's not that hard. You don't have to go back to, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but you don't have to. The argument doesn't require that. And I think, for black folks, and in fact, not just black folks, I think finding those specific cases of reparations across the board is probably the beginnings of it.
So this question, what do you see as the role of the Black public intellectual in the age of Twitter and Trump?
I'm not rolling my eyes at the person who asked that question. I just want to be clear. I don't mean any disrespect to that. That's a difficult one for me because I don't like being called that. I hate, and people call me that anyway. And I guess I just need to accept that, you get to a point in your life and you don't get to name yourself anymore. But I never saw myself as an intellectual. I think of intellectuals as people whose primary job is to give opinions, and even though I've spent the last hour doing that, it's actually not my primary job. The whole reason that this is like the like if you had an iceberg. This is the tip. You see this visible thing where this guy gives the talk, but beneath that is actually, as much as I love being here with you guys, beneath that is what I was doing, before I got up here talking, which was watching other people talk and getting educated. This has a lot to do with how I came into the field. I came into the field as a journalist. What you do as a journalist, you go around and you interview people. Even as you have your opinions, you go around and you're constantly taking in, you're reading. Those private moments of trying to answer questions for myself is the most beautiful aspect of the work I do. I love being here, with you guys, but I'd much rather be taking than giving when it comes to information. I'd much rather be in here. I'd much rather have one of you up here and me down there. Now, I recognize that's not possible. Or not the reason I was brought to Hawaii in the first place. I get that that's not what the sponsors had in mind. And that's fine, that's okay. But it's not how I think about myself. And during the time I was on Twitter, I think I probably reinforced that notion a little too much. I don't know that I can... There's like this seat in Black America that is very traditionally occupied by Black men. And it's the idea that at that particular time, be it Du Bois, be it Baldwin, be it Wright, this is the person that, you go to interpret Black people for you. And I don't think that seat should exist. It's not even that I don't want to sit in it. I actually don't think it should exist. You were talking about 40 million people who have a diverse, if we want to call it this, intellectual class. People who have read things, thought about things, written things, have, particular areas of specialty. I don't feel myself, I just don't think it's just that I should somehow be promoted into some seat over them. I don't think that's just. That's not how I feel when I'm in the community. That's not how I've felt. I'm 42 years old now. That's not how I've felt. I've been writing as a professional for 22 years. I would not characterize the majority of my career as that way. I didn't go into debates with other Black people, for instance, at Howard University, and people fell down like this and said, okay, we're now going to listen to him. That's not how it worked. That's not how it works now when I'm around my friends from that period who are, they don't just say, oh, They don't do that. We go back and forth. And so while I appreciate The accolades and the awards that I get, I appreciate the titles that, people bestow that are, in fact, and they're my honorifics. I don't think I can accept it myself. So it's very difficult for me to answer that question because I probably don't think those people should exist in the first place.
You mentioned the existence of this intellectual class, or maybe intellectual is not the right word, thinkers and people who
Right.
are visionary. We were really fortunate to have Patrice Cullors here from Black Lives Matter earlier this summer on the stage to talk a little bit. And that whole movement was really kind of propelled through social media,
Right.
Twitter, and things like that. So
Right.
just maybe pushing on this question a little bit more.
Right.
What value do you see, or have you seen, or what potential application might there be for, getting outside of
Right.
the PhDs and
Right.
all those folks,
Right.
thinking about the ways that Black folks are pushing intellectual conversations around freedom and justice?
Yeah, I think the tools of social media are tremendously important for, particularly for Black activists and Black organizers. I think on a certain level, Black people who want to write, who want to have the luxury of spending their lives asking questions, about the world and about their world is probably important there too. But you got to be careful. You got to be real careful. I look at Colin Kaepernick, and one of the most impressive things, there's a piece in the Times about this today, is how he has used the power of silence. And right now, because it wasn't, and I understand why this is the case, it wasn't like this, 20 years ago. You couldn't just say, what you wanted to say. You couldn't just, publicize your opinions to the world the way you can now. I think sometimes, and I include myself in this, in the period that I was on Twitter, you can become enamored with that, with the ability to say anything. But, maybe now is the time. And again, I'm not talking about activists and all, because I think it's different there. I think it's a very, very different thing, for what, Patrice is doing. But for those of us who want to write, I think we should be careful, about what we're saying and about, what we're putting out in the world.
Thank you. Well, we are actually at time. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
being
guys.
here. Join me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.